Captain Jae-yun Park stood at her bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her small apartment wasn't much, but it gave her a perfect view of the quiet suburban street below. After 15 years in special forces, the peace and quiet felt strange, almost uncomfortable. She turned away from the window and looked at her reflection in the mirror. At 35, she still maintained the fit physique that had served her well during countless missions. Her dark skin gleamed in the early morning light, a testament to her mixed heritage. Korean father, African-American mother. It was a combination that had turned heads throughout her life, sometimes in curiosity, sometimes in prejudice. The alarm on her phone buzzed. 6:00 a.m. Old habits died hard. Even after 3 months of civilian life, she still woke up before dawn, still did her morning exercises, still checked all the windows and doors before going to bed. Some things you just couldn't unlearn. Jae-yun pulled on her running shoes and headed outside. The neighborhood was starting to wake up. Mr. Thompson next door was already watering his prized roses. He waved at her, and she waved back. It had taken him 2 weeks to stop calling her that new Oriental girl, but now he just called her Miss Park, which was progress. As she jogged her usual route, Jae-yun's mind wandered to the letter she'd received yesterday from her old commanding officer. Another job offer, private security for some billionaire in Dubai. The money was good, really good, but she'd made a promise to stay close to her grandmother, and Park women kept their promises. Her grandmother, Soon-hye, lived just 15 minutes away by car. At 78, she was still sharp as a tack, but her body was slowly betraying her. The doctors had found early signs of Parkinson's 6 months ago, right when Jae-yun was considering extending her service. That news had made her decision for her. The community center came into view as she rounded the corner. The old brick building wasn't much to look at, but it had become her second home. 3 times a week, she taught self-defense classes there. Today was women's basic training, her favorite group. "Good morning, Captain Park." The voice belonged to Maya, the center's receptionist. She was one of the few people who knew about Jae-yun's military background, though not the full extent of it. Nobody here needed to know about the midnight raids, the undercover operations, or the times she'd had to make impossible choices in far-off places that never made the news. "Morning, Maya. Any new sign-ups for today's class?" 2 new ladies, both seemed pretty nervous. One of them asked if it was okay that she'd never exercised before. Jae-yun smiled. "Tell them they'll fit right in." She headed to the locker room to change. The community center job barely paid enough to cover her groceries, but money wasn't why she did it. Every woman who learned to stand up for herself, to feel confident in her own strength, that was worth more than any private security paycheck. Her phone buzzed again. A text from her grandmother. "Don't forget dinner tonight. Making your favorite japchae." Jae-yun texted back a quick reply and a heart emoji. Her grandmother had embraced modern technology with surprising enthusiasm, though she still occasionally sent messages in all caps because she thought it made them more important. The morning class went smoothly. Jae-yun watched with satisfaction as her students practiced basic blocks and strikes. The new women, as usual, started out hesitant but gained confidence as the hour progressed. She kept the movements simple, the instructions clear. This wasn't about creating warriors. It was about building confidence and awareness. After class, while wiping down the practice mats, Jae-yun overheard 2 of her students talking in hushed voices about the steel serpents. The name had been coming up more and more lately. A motorcycle gang that had moved into the area a few months ago, throwing their weight around, causing trouble. "They were at my brother's store yesterday," one woman said. "Just stood there, knocking things off shelves, asking if he had proper insurance. He called the police, but they took their time showing up. By then, the bikers were long gone." Jae-yun's jaw tightened, but she kept cleaning. It wasn't her job anymore to fight other people's battles. She'd done enough of that. Still, She made a mental note to take a different route home that evening, one that passed by the brothers' store, just to observe. Old habits. The rest of her day passed quietly. She taught 2 more classes, one for seniors focusing on balance and flexibility, another for teenagers interested in martial arts. Between sessions, she caught up on paperwork and helped Maya organize the center's upcoming community fair. At 5 o'clock, she locked up the practice room and headed to her car. The summer sun was still high in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She took her time driving to her grandmother's house, deliberately passing through the business district. Sure enough, she spotted them. 3 motorcycles parked outside the Golden Phoenix, a small Chinese restaurant. The bikes were expensive customs, chrome gleaming in the sunlight. Their owners weren't anywhere in sight, but their presence alone was enough to make pedestrians cross to the other side of the street. Jai Yun drove past slowly, memorizing the license plates out of habit. She'd seen enough insurgent groups and criminal organizations to recognize the signs of escalating territory marking. These weren't just troublemakers. They were establishing dominance, testing boundaries. Her grandmother's house sat on a quiet street lined with old maple trees. The small garden in front was immaculate. Soon-Hee might have trouble walking some days, but she still tended her plants with religious devotion. "You're thinking too hard again," her grandmother said as soon as she walked in. Soon-Hee stood at the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled amazing. "I can see it in your face." "Just work stuff. Halmioni." Jai Yun kissed her grandmother's cheek and began setting the table, falling into their comfortable routine. "Work stuff doesn't usually make you frown like that. That's your special forces frown. I remember it from when you'd call home during your service." Jai Yun shook her head, smiling despite herself. "Nothing gets past you, does it? I raised your father, didn't I? And he was an even worse liar than you." Soon-Hee brought the food to the table: japchae, kimchi, and soup that had probably been simmering all day. "Now tell me what's really bothering you." Over dinner, Jai Yun told her grandmother about the steel serpents, about the whispered conversations she'd been hearing, about the growing fear in the community. Soon-Hee listened quietly, her chopsticks moving with deliberate grace. "You know," Soon-Hee said finally, "when your father first brought your mother home, there were people who didn't approve. Not just Koreans, but everyone. Some men used to drive by our house at night, shouting things." She paused, a small smile playing at her lips, "until your mother caught one of them and demonstrated some of her Marine Corps training." Jai Yun laughed. "I remember that story. Dad said he fell in love with her all over again when she put that guy in a wrist lock." The point is, sometimes people need to be reminded that their actions have consequences. Soon-Hee reached across the table and patted Jai Yun's hand. "Just be careful, whatever you decide to do." "I'm not deciding to do anything, Halmioni." "Of course not." Soon-Hee's eyes twinkled. More soup. After dinner, Jai Yun helped clean up and spent some time going through her grandmother's medications, organizing them for the week ahead. It was past 9 when she finally headed home, taking the long way again to check on the Golden Phoenix. The motorcycles were gone, but she noticed some fresh graffiti on the wall. 3 intertwined serpents forming a crude S. Back in her apartment, Jai Yun went through her evening routine. Check the windows, check the doors, 10 minutes of meditation. But tonight, she added something extra. From the back of her closet, she pulled out a small safe. Inside was her service pistol, properly registered for civilian ownership, and a folder containing contacts she'd hoped never to need again. She didn't open the folder or touch the pistol. Just knowing they were there was enough for now. Instead, she sat on her bed and opened her laptop, beginning to research everything she could find about the steel serpents. If things got worse, and her experience told her they would, she wanted to be prepared. Her phone buzzed one last time for the day. A text from Maya. "You were right about those new ladies. They already signed up for next week's class. You're making a real difference here." Jai Yun smiled and set her phone aside. Maybe that was enough. Teaching women to be strong, to stand up for themselves. Maybe she didn't need to be Captain Park anymore, didn't need to carry the weight of protecting everyone. But as she lay in bed, listening to the quiet sounds of the suburb at night, she couldn't shake the feeling that her two worlds were about to collide. The peaceful life she'd been building and the skilled operator she'd become. Sooner or later, she'd have to reconcile them. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, she dreamed of distant firefights and the weight of responsibility. In her dreams, she was back in uniform, making the hard choices, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. But this time, instead of foreign territories, she was standing on her own street, watching 3 serpents slither through the shadows, growing bolder with each passing day. She woke before her alarm, the first light of dawn barely touching the horizon. Another day in civilian life was beginning. But something had shifted, some decision had been made in the quiet hours of the night. As she laced up her running shoes, Jae-yun Park knew that sooner or later she would have to do more than just observe. The question wasn't if, but when. And more importantly, how to handle it in a way that wouldn't compromise everything she'd built here. Because this wasn't a military operation in some far-off land. This was home. And protecting home meant fighting smarter, not just harder. She stepped outside into the cool morning air, ready to begin another day of teaching, watching, and waiting. The time would come, and when it did, the steel serpents would learn what so many others had learned before them. Appearances could be deceiving, and underestimating the wrong person could be a very expensive mistake. A week had passed since Jae-yun first noticed the steel serpents at the Golden Phoenix restaurant. The summer heat had grown stronger, and with it, the gang's boldness. She watched from her car as 2 members walked out of a convenience store, neither bothering to pay for the drinks in their hands. The store owner stood in the doorway, anger and fear mixing on his face. Jae-yun gripped her steering wheel tighter. The gang members wore black leather vests with their symbol, 3 intertwined serpents, sewn on the back. One was tall and muscular, the other shorter but just as broad. Both had the swagger of men used to taking what they wanted. Her phone rang, breaking her focus. It was Maya from the community center. Captain Park, I hate to ask this, but could you come in early today? Mrs. Lee is here, and she's pretty shaken up. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Jae-yun answered, starting her car. At the community center, she found Mrs. Lee sitting in the office, holding a tissue to her face. The elderly Korean woman owned a small grocery store that Jae-yun often visited. Today, her usual calm demeanor was replaced with visible distress. They came this morning, Mrs. Lee said when Jae-yun sat down beside her. 3 of them. They said times are changing, that my kind needed to understand the new rules. She dabbed at her eyes. They'd broke things, knocked over displays, said next time they'd do worse if I didn't pay for protection. Jae-yun felt a familiar tension in her jaw, the same tension she used to feel before a mission. Did you call the police? Mrs. Lee gave a bitter laugh. They came, took notes, said they'd look into it, just like they did for the others. Jae-yun had been hearing about more incidents. The gang was moving systematically through the neighborhood, targeting minority-owned businesses first. It was a classic intimidation strategy, one she'd seen before in different contexts. I'm going to teach you something, Jae-yun said, her voice gentle but firm. She helped Mrs. Lee to her feet. Come with me to the practice room. For the next hour, Jae-yun showed Mrs. Lee basic security measures, how to position displays to eliminate blind spots, where to install cameras for the best coverage. Simple but effective ways to make her store less vulnerable. She didn't mention her military background, but she drew on years of experience in threat assessment. Thank you, Mrs. Lee said as they finished. She looked steadier now, more like herself. You remind me of my daughter. She's a doctor in Chicago, always trying to fix things. After Mrs. Lee left, Jae-yun went through her regular classes, but her mind kept returning to the situation. During the afternoon break, She made some calls to old contacts, speaking in carefully coded language. By evening, she had a clearer picture of what she was dealing with. The Steel Serpents weren't just a local gang. They were an offshoot of a larger organization, trying to establish new territory. Their leader, Ta-Ho Kim, had a record of violence stretching back 15 years. He'd spent time in prison for assault, but had avoided longer sentences through witness intimidation and careful legal maneuvering. Jai-yun drove to her grandmother's house for their regular dinner, taking the route past Mrs. Lee's store. She noticed fresh graffiti on nearby walls, more serpent symbols. The gang was marking their territory, growing bolder with each passing day. "You're late," Soon-hai said when Jai-yun arrived. But her grandmother's mild scolding stopped when she saw Jai-yun's expression. What happened? Over bowls of steaming soup, Jai-yun told her about Mrs. Lee. Soon-hai listened quietly, her face growing serious. "I knew Mrs. Lee's mother," Soon-hai said finally. "When we first came to this country, her family helped us find an apartment. Back then, we all looked out for each other. We had to. Things haven't changed as much as we'd like to think," Jai-yun replied. "No," Soon-hai agreed. "But now we have you." Jai-yun started to protest, but her grandmother held up a hand. "I know that look in your eyes, child. You're planning something. Just remember what I taught you about using the right tool for the right job." Later that night, after making sure her grandmother had taken her evening medications, Jai-yun drove home slowly, taking time to observe the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, but she noticed more businesses had started closing early. People hurried to their cars, looking over their shoulders. Fear was taking root. Back in her apartment, Jai-yun opened her laptop and began creating a detailed map of recent incidents. She marked each reported location of gang activity, each piece of graffiti, each business that had been threatened. A pattern emerged. They were working their way through the neighborhood in a systematic way, testing responses, identifying weak points. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Just heard Golden Phoenix is closing down. Owner's nephew got hurt today trying to stop some trouble." Jai-yun's hands tightened on her phone. The Golden Phoenix had been there for 30 years. She'd eaten there with her parents as a child, celebrated birthdays there. Now it was becoming another casualty of fear. She looked at her reflection in the window. Captain Park of Special Forces would have already taken action, would have used her training to shut down the threat quickly and efficiently. But civilian Jai-yun had to be smarter, had to find a way to handle this without destroying the life she was building here. A plan began to form in her mind. She opened the folder from her safe, reviewing old contacts. One name stood out: Detective James Wilson, now working in the local police department. They'd worked together on a joint task force years ago. He was one of the few who knew her full background. She sent him a carefully worded message. "Remember Jakarta. Similar situation developing here. Need your insight." His reply came quickly. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., usual place." Jai-yun spent the next hour going through her evening routine, but with an additional step. She pulled out her old combat boots and began conditioning the leather. Next came her tactical gear, carefully hidden in ordinary gym bags. She wasn't planning to use them yet, but being prepared was ingrained in her nature. That night, she dreamed of her last mission in Special Forces. It had been a hostage extraction in a remote location. Her team had succeeded, but not before she'd had to make some hard choices. She woke before dawn, the memory of those choices still fresh in her mind. During her morning run, she took a new route that passed by several of the threatened businesses. Most were still closed, their windows dark. But at Mrs. Lee's store, she saw lights on early. The old woman was inside, rearranging displays just as Jai-yun had shown her, making sure there were no blind spots. Jai-yun smiled. One person standing up made it easier for others to find their courage. She arrived at the community center early, spending time to check all the security cameras and locks. Maya arrived just as she finished. "You know something's going to happen, don't you?" Maya asked, watching Jai-yun test the back door's lock. I can tell by how you're acting. It's like when you know a storm is coming. Sometimes the best way to handle a storm is to prepare for it, Jae-yun replied. Make sure everyone knows about the new security procedures we discussed. And Maya, if you see any of the steel serpents around here, don't engage. Just call me. The morning passed slowly. Jae-yun taught her classes, watched her students grow stronger and more confident. But part of her mind was always working, planning, preparing. At 10 o'clock, she left Maya in charge and drove to meet Detective Wilson. The coffee shop was quiet, tucked away in a part of town the steel serpents hadn't reached yet. Wilson sat in a corner booth, looking older than she remembered but still sharp-eyed. You look good, Captain, he said as she sat down. Civilian life suits you. Usually, she replied. But we have a problem. For the next hour, they talked. Jae-yun shared what she knew about the steel serpents, and Wilson filled in more details. The gang had tried this before in other cities, but they'd never been successfully prosecuted. They were too careful, too good at intimidating witnesses. The brass won't admit it, Wilson said, but we're understaffed and outmaneuvered. Every time we get close to building a case, witnesses disappear or change their stories. What if you had evidence they couldn't intimidate away? Jae-yun asked. Digital evidence, properly obtained, showing clear criminal activity. Wilson leaned forward. That would be interesting. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Of course, Jae-yun agreed. Hypothetically, someone with my background might know how to gather such evidence legally. They parted with a better understanding. Wilson couldn't officially sanction anything, but he gave her a burner phone number and a promise to act quickly when the time came. Back at the community center, Jae-yun found Maya looking worried. 3 of them were here while you were gone, she said. They wanted to talk about using our parking lot for their bikes. I told them they needed to submit a formal request to the board. Jae-yun's expression hardened. The community center was supposed to be neutral ground. By coming here, the steel serpents were sending a message. Nowhere was off limits. That evening, instead of going straight to her grandmother's house, Jae-yun drove past the Golden Phoenix again. The windows were dark, but she saw movement inside. 3 motorcycles were parked outside, their chrome gleaming in the setting sun. She parked across the street and waited. After a few minutes, she saw Tae-ho Kim himself emerge from the restaurant. He was shorter than she expected, but carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being feared. 2 larger men flanked him, their leather vests marking them as his lieutenants. As they mounted their bikes, Tae-ho looked around the street. For a moment, his eyes seemed to meet Jae-yun's through her car window. Then he smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes, and led his men away. Jae-yun watched them go, her military training noting details automatically. Their riding formation, their likely route, the way they communicated with hand signals. All information that could be useful later. Her phone buzzed, her grandmother asking where she was. Jae-yun started her car, but her mind was already moving ahead, planning her next steps. The storm was coming, just as Maya had said. But storms could be weathered if you were properly prepared. And Jae-yun Park had spent 15 years learning how to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. The night air was thick with humidity as Jae-yun left her grandmother's house. It was later than usual, almost midnight. Soon-hai hadn't been feeling well, so Jae-yun had stayed to make sure her evening medications were working properly. Now, the streets were quiet except for the distant sound of crickets. She needed gas. The gauge on her car was hovering near empty, and she had to teach early classes tomorrow. The only station still open at this hour was the one near the highway, a good 15 minutes away. Jae-yun drove carefully, noting how few cars were on the road. Even the usual late-night food places were closed, their windows dark behind newly installed security gates. The gas station's fluorescent lights created pools of harsh white light in the darkness. One other car was there, an old sedan with a tired-looking man filling up his tank. Jai-yun pulled up to a pump and got out of her car. The night air smelled like rain. As she inserted her credit card, she heard them before she saw them. The deep rumble of multiple motorcycles approaching. Her military training kicked in automatically. She noted exits, cover positions, sightlines. The gas station had security cameras, but she knew from experience that such systems weren't always reliable. 5 motorcycles pulled into the station, their engines unnecessarily loud in the quiet night. The man with the sedan quickly finished his purchase and drove away. Jai-yun kept her movements calm and steady as she began filling her tank. She recognized 2 of the riders from her surveillance. Dong-hyuk, one of Tai-ho's lieutenants, and his usual followers. The bikers parked their motorcycles in a semicircle, effectively blocking the exit. They dismounted slowly, making a show of it. Dong-hyuk, a tall man with broad shoulders, took off his helmet and stared directly at Jai-yun. "Well, look what we have here," he said, his voice carrying across the empty station. "Isn't it past your bedtime?" Jai-yun didn't respond. She kept her eyes on the gas pump's display, but her awareness extended to every movement around her. 4 of the bikers were spreading out, trying to surround her position. The 5th stayed with the bikes, watching the road. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Dong-hyuk said, moving closer. "Don't they teach manners where you come from?" "I was born here," Jai-yun said calmly, still not looking at him. "Just like you." This seemed to anger him. "You think you know me? You think you know anything about this place?" He was close enough now that she could smell leather and cigarette smoke. "This neighborhood is changing. People like you need to understand that." Jai-yun removed the gas nozzle and replaced it in its holder. Her tank was only half full, but that would have to be enough. As she turned to get back in her car, one of the other bikers stepped into her path. "We're not done talking," Dong-hyuk said. "Maybe you haven't heard, but when the steel serpents want to have a conversation, people listen." Jai-yun took a slow breath. She thought about Mrs. Lee's tearful face, about the golden phoenix's dark windows, about her grandmother's worried expressions. She thought about 15 years of training, of making hard choices in dangerous places. "Move away from my car," she said quietly. They laughed. The sound echoed off the gas station's metal roof. "Or what?" Dong-hyuk asked, stepping even closer. "What's a little lady like you going to do?" Jai-yun finally turned to face him fully. "Last warning," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Step back and let me leave." Instead, Dong-hyuk reached for her arm. It was a mistake. In one fluid motion, Jai-yun grabbed his extended hand and twisted. Before anyone could react, Dong-hyuk was on his knees, his arm locked behind him at an angle that promised extreme pain if he moved. One of the other bikers started to say, but Jai-yun was already moving. She released Dong-hyuk with a push that sent him sprawling and stepped away from the gas pump. Training took over. Assess threats. Control the space. Minimize damage. 2 bikers rushed her at once. She sidestepped the first one's wild punch and used his momentum to send him crashing into his friend. They went down in a tangle of limbs. The 3rd pulled out a knife, its blade glinting under the fluorescent lights. "That was a big mistake," he growled, circling her. Jai-yun didn't waste energy responding. She watched his feet, saw the telegraph of his lunge before he made it. When he stabbed forward, she wasn't there anymore. A quick strike to his wrist sent the knife clattering across the concrete. Another hit to his solar plexus dropped him to his knees. Dong-hyuk had regained his feet. He pulled something from his vest, brass knuckles that gleamed dully in the artificial light. "You're dead," he snarled. "You hear me? Dead." Jai-yun settled into a defensive stance. "Walk away," she said. "Tell your boss this area is off limits. No one else needs to get hurt." He charged her with a roar of rage. Jai-yun waited until the last possible moment, then moved. Her years of training made it almost effortless. She redirected his charge, added her own force to his momentum, and sent him flying. He crashed into a display of windshield washer fluid, plastic bottles scattering everywhere. The two bikers she'd knocked down earlier were up again, but they were more cautious now. They tried to flank her, looking for an opening. Jai-yun kept moving, never letting them get behind her. When they finally rushed her together, she was ready. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. When it was over, all 5 bikers were on the ground, groaning. None were seriously injured. Jai-yun had made sure of that. But their pride was severely wounded. She walked over to where Dong-hak lay amid the scattered bottles. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice low and intense. "I know who you are. I know who Tai-ho is. This stops now. No more threats. No more intimidation. This neighborhood is under protection. You don't know what you're starting." Dong-hak spat. "When Tai-ho hears about this, tell him everything." Jai-yun interrupted. "Tell him exactly what happened. Tell him that next time I won't be so gentle." She turned and walked back to her car. The biker who had been watching the bikes had fled, probably to report to Tai-ho. That was fine. Let him report. Let them know that someone had finally stood up to them. As she drove away, she saw in her rearview mirror the bikers helping each other up, their movements stiff and pained. They would be sore tomorrow, but nothing was broken. She had been careful about that. This was a message, not a war. Not yet, anyway. Her phone rang. It was Detective Wilson. "Just got a call about a disturbance at the highway gas station," he said without preamble. "Anything I should know about?" "The security cameras should have caught everything," Jai-yun replied. "Might be worth looking at the footage." There was a pause. "You okay?" "Not a scratch." "They'll retaliate," Wilson warned. "You know that, right?" "I'm counting on it," Jai-yun said. "But next time, they'll be the ones breaking the law on camera. And you'll have your evidence." She ended the call and drove home, taking a circuitous route to make sure she wasn't followed. Her military training was still humming in her veins, keeping her alert and focused. But underneath that professional calm, a small part of her felt satisfied. In her apartment, Jai-yun went through her usual security checks, then sat down at her laptop. She wrote a detailed report of the incident, including descriptions of each biker and their fighting capabilities. It was an old habit from her Special Forces days, but it might be useful later. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Just saw police cars heading toward the highway. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Jai-yun replied. "But tomorrow might be interesting. Make sure the center's security cameras are working." She took a shower, letting the hot water ease muscles that weren't as tense as they should have been after a fight. This confrontation had been coming for weeks. In a way, it was almost a relief that it had finally happened. As she got ready for bed, she thought about what would come next. Tai-ho wouldn't let this challenge go unanswered. He built his reputation on fear and the idea that no one could stand up to him. Having one of his lieutenants beaten by a woman, a minority woman, would demand a response. But that response would have to wait until morning. For now, Jai-yun allowed herself a small smile as she set her alarm. She had early classes to teach tomorrow, and her students deserved her full attention. The steel serpents could wait. Her last thought before sleep was of her grandmother's words from weeks ago. Sometimes people need to be reminded that their actions have consequences. Tonight, she had delivered that reminder. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, and she would be ready. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the sky as Jai-yun drifted off to sleep. The storm was finally breaking, just as she had known it would. But she had weathered worse storms than this, in places far more dangerous than a suburban gas station. Let them come, she thought. Let them learn what her enemies in Special Forces had learned, that appearances could be deceiving, and that underestimating her was always a costly mistake. The next morning dawned bright and humid. Jai-yun woke before her alarm, her body still alert from the previous night's confrontation. She checked her phone and found several messages waiting. The first was from Detective Wilson. Video footage secured. clear self-defense. No charges filed. The second message was from Maya. You need to see this. Maya had attached a link to a local news website. The gas station's security footage had leaked online and was spreading fast. The video showed the entire incident from multiple angles, the quality surprisingly good under the bright station lights. Jae-yun watched herself take down 5 men with clinical efficiency, the movements looking almost like a dance in the grainy footage. She got ready for work quickly, knowing today would be different. As she drove to the community center, she noticed people looking at their phones, showing screens to each other. The video was spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. Maya was waiting at the front desk when Jae-yun arrived. The phone hasn't stopped ringing, she said. Everyone wants to know if you're teaching extra self-defense classes. Keep the regular schedule, Jae-yun replied. But we might need to add some new sessions next week. Her first class was larger than usual. Word had spread, and several new faces appeared, including Mrs. Lee's teenage daughter. Jae-yun kept the lesson focused on basics, just as she always did, but she could feel the energy in the room was different. People weren't just learning moves now. They were seeing possibilities. During the lunch break, Detective Wilson called again. Taeho's on the move, he said. He called a meeting of all his lieutenants this morning. My sources say he's furious. Good, Jae-yun said. Angry people make mistakes. Be careful, Wilson warned. He's got a reputation for taking things personally. After hanging up, Jae-yun checked the community center's security cameras. Everything looked normal, but she noticed more people walking past the windows than usual, some taking pictures with their phones. The video had made her a local celebrity, whether she wanted it or not. In the afternoon, Mrs. Lee visited the center. She carried a large container of homemade kimchi. My store is full today, she said, her eyes bright. People are coming just to show support. One of the steel serpents rode past this morning, but 3 young men from the neighborhood stood outside until he left. Jae-yun accepted the kimchi with a smile. The neighborhood is stronger than they thought. Because of you, Mrs. Lee said. You showed us we don't have to be afraid. But Jae-yun knew better. The real fight was just beginning. Taeho wouldn't let this humiliation stand. He would respond, and his response would be calculated to restore his gang's fearsome reputation. She wasn't wrong. That evening, as she was locking up the community center, Maya rushed in from her break. They're at the Golden Phoenix, she said breathlessly. At least 20 bikes. They're smashing everything. Jae-yun was already moving. Call Detective Wilson. Tell him exactly what you told me. She drove to the restaurant quickly but carefully. Even from 2 blocks away, she could hear the sound of breaking glass and revving motorcycles. A crowd had gathered at a safe distance, many recording with their phones. The steel serpents had formed a circle around the restaurant, their bikes creating a barrier. Inside, shadows moved past the broken windows. Jae-yun parked her car and walked forward calmly. Some people in the crowd recognized her from the video. She heard whispers, saw phones turning to record her approach. She ignored them all, her focus entirely on the scene ahead. Taeho Kim stood in front of the restaurant, watching his men work. He was shorter than his lieutenants, but carried himself with obvious authority. When he saw Jae-yun approaching, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. I was hoping you'd show up, he said loudly. The famous Special Forces woman. Did you think one lucky fight would scare us away? Jae-yun stopped at the edge of the bike circle. This isn't going to end the way you think it will. No. Taeho spread his arms wide. Look around. Look how many of us there are. Look how many phones are recording. After tonight, everyone will know what happens when someone challenges the steel serpents. You're right about one thing, Jae-yun said. Everyone is recording, including the new security cameras the police installed last week. The ones Detective Wilson suggested to the business owners. The ones that are streaming directly to the police station right now. Taeho's smile faltered slightly. In the distance, sirens began to wail. You have about 2 minutes, Jai-yun continued. That's how long it takes to get here from the station. Every officer in the district is responding. They're not coming for a simple vandalism call. They're coming because they have video evidence of organized crime, of your gang terrorizing businesses. Federal charges, not local ones. The sirens were getting closer. Some of the younger gang members were already moving toward their bikes. You're bluffing, Taiho said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. 1 minute 30 seconds. Jai-yun replied calmly. Your choice. Stay and face federal charges, or leave. Either way, your hold on this neighborhood is done. Taiho's face twisted with rage. He started to reach inside his jacket, but Jai-yun's voice stopped him. Think carefully, she said. The cameras are still recording. Whatever you're reaching for, ask yourself if it's worth 20 years in federal prison. The sirens were very close now. Blue and red lights began to reflect off the buildings. Ride! Taiho shouted. His men scrambled for their bikes. The roar of engines filled the air as the steel serpents began to scatter. Taiho was the last to mount his motorcycle. This isn't over, he snarled at Jai-yun. Yes, she replied. It is. The gang roared away just as the first police cars arrived. Detective Wilson was among them, along with several federal agents he had called after the gas station incident. They would find plenty of evidence inside the restaurant. Evidence of organized crime, of protection rackets, of systematic intimidation. The crowd that had gathered began to cheer. Someone started chanting Captain Park. Others joined in. Jai-yun ignored them, walking instead to where the restaurant's elderly owner stood in the doorway, surveying the damage. We'll help you clean up, she said. The whole neighborhood will help. The old man looked at her with tears in his eyes. Thank you, he said simply. Over the next few hours, people from the neighborhood came together to help board up windows and clean up broken glass. Mrs. Lee brought food for the workers. Young men who had watched from a distance earlier now worked alongside their elders. The community center provided a base for organizing volunteers. Jai-yun worked alongside everyone else, helping where she could. She noticed Detective Wilson taking statements, federal agents documenting evidence. The system was finally working the way it should. Her phone buzzed. A text from her grandmother. Come to dinner when you're done. Bring Detective Wilson. I made extra. Later that night, sitting in her grandmother's kitchen with Wilson, Jai-yun finally allowed herself to relax slightly. Soon-hai served them both huge portions of food and insisted they eat before talking business. The gang's finished in this area, Wilson said finally, accepting a second helping of Soon-hai's cooking. We've got enough evidence now to bring serious charges. Taiho's probably already running, but we'll find him. The neighborhood will be watching. Jai-yun said. They won't let this happen again. Because of you, Wilson replied. You gave them something they needed. Hope. Soon-hai snorted. She gave them more than hope. She gave them an example. Show people it's possible to stand up, and they'll find their own strength. The next morning, Jai-yun arrived at the community center to find a line of people waiting. They all wanted to sign up for self-defense classes. Maya had already started a waiting list. We're going to need more instructors, Maya said, showing Jai-yun the growing list of names. We'll figure it out, Jai-yun replied, one step at a time. As she prepared for her first class of the day, Jai-yun thought about how quickly things had changed. The steel serpents had thought they could rule through fear, but they had failed to understand something important. A community united was stronger than any gang. Sometimes it just needed someone to take the first stand. Outside her window, she could see people going about their business, shops opening, children walking to school. The neighborhood was healing, growing stronger. And if trouble came again, from the steel serpents or anyone else, they would face not just one special forces veteran, but an entire community ready to stand together. Jai-yun smiled and turned to greet her students. She had a lot to teach them, and not just about self-defense. They would learn about strength, about community, about standing up for what was right. The real victory wasn't in fighting. It was in building something worth protecting. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the Golden Phoenix. The summer heat had begun to fade, bringing cooler mornings and earlier sunsets. Jia-yun stood in front of her expanded self-defense class, watching as 30 students practiced their basic moves. The community center had cleared out an additional room to accommodate all the new participants. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Detective Wilson. Found him. Moving in today. Thought you should know. Jia-yun had been expecting this news. After the incident at the Golden Phoenix, Tae-ho had disappeared, but his gang had completely fallen apart. Many members had been arrested based on the evidence collected from security cameras. Others had simply left town, not wanting to face federal charges. Good form, Mrs. Lee, Jia-yun called out, watching the elderly woman execute a perfect blocking movement. The store owner had become one of her most dedicated students, attending every class she could. After class, Maya handed Jia-yun a stack of registration forms. "We have enough people for 3 more classes," she said, "and the community board approved your proposal for the youth program." Jia-yun nodded, reviewing the forms. The youth program had been her idea. Teaching young people not just self-defense, but community responsibility and leadership. It would start next month, funded by donations from local businesses. Her phone rang again. This time it was her grandmother. "Have you seen the news?" Soon-hae asked without greeting. "They caught him trying to cross the state line. It's all over the internet." Jia-yun hadn't checked the news yet, but she wasn't surprised. Tae-ho had been running out of options. His network had crumbled, his supporters had abandoned him, and the federal investigation had frozen his assets. "Come to dinner tonight," Soon-hae continued. "The whole neighborhood is celebrating. Mrs. Lee is bringing her special kimchi, and Mr. Chen from the Golden Phoenix is making his secret recipe dumplings." The Golden Phoenix had reopened last week, stronger than ever. The community had come together to repair the damage, and business was booming. Every table was filled most nights, and Mr. Chen had even hired extra help to keep up with demand. "I'll be there," Jia-yun promised. "After my evening class." The evening class was her favorite, a mixed group of all ages and backgrounds, united in their desire to learn. Today, they were practicing situation awareness and escape techniques. Jia-yun moved among her students, correcting stances and offering encouragement. "Remember," she told them, "the best defense is avoiding conflict altogether. Be aware of your surroundings. Trust your instincts, and most importantly, know that you're not alone." After class, Jia-yun drove to her grandmother's house. The street was filled with parked cars, and she could hear music and laughter coming from the open windows. Soon-hae's small house had become a gathering place for the community, especially on important occasions. Inside, the house was packed with people. Mrs. Lee was in the kitchen with Soon-hae, arguing good-naturedly about the proper amount of garlic in kimchi. Mr. Chen was teaching some young people how to fold dumplings. Detective Wilson stood in a corner, talking with federal agents who had worked on the case. The hero arrives. Someone called out when Jia-yun entered. She shook her head, embarrassed by the attention, but people insisted on congratulating her. "Did you hear the details?" Wilson asked, making his way over to her. Tae-ho was trying to rebuild his gang in another state, but his reputation was ruined. Nobody wanted to work with the leader who got beaten by one woman at a gas station. Jia-yun accepted a plate of food from her grandmother. "How long will he serve?" "With the federal charges, at least 15 years. Maybe more. We found evidence linking him to crimes in 3 other states. He won't be causing trouble for a long time." The celebration continued into the evening. People shared stories about how the neighborhood had changed. Business owners talked about increased customers and a renewed sense of community. Young people discussed plans for neighborhood watch programs and community improvement projects. Maya arrived late, carrying a surprise: a framed newspaper article about the community center's expanded programs. The headline read, Local center builds strength through unity. There was a photo of Jai-yun teaching a class, her students of all ages and backgrounds practicing together. "We're hanging this in the center's lobby," Maya announced, to remind everyone how it started. Jai-yun studied the photo. She saw not just students learning self-defense, but a community learning to stand together. The steel serpents had thought they could rule through fear and division. Instead, they had accidentally helped create something stronger: unity. Later that night, after most guests had left, Jai-yun sat in her grandmother's kitchen. Soon-hae was making tea, humming softly to herself. "I got another job offer today," Jai-yun said. "Private security firm in New York. The salary is impressive." Soon-hae set a cup of tea in front of her granddaughter. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them I already have a job, one that matters." Her grandmother smiled. "Your father would be proud. Your mother too. They always said you would find your own way to serve." Jai-yun sipped her tea, thinking about the changes in her life. When she'd left Special Forces, she'd worried about losing her purpose. But she'd found a new mission, one just as important as any she'd undertaken in uniform. The next morning, Jai-yun arrived at the community center early. She had papers to grade. Her students now took written tests on conflict avoidance and community responsibility, not just practical self-defense skills. The youth program would start soon, and she wanted everything ready. Maya came in with coffee and news. "The Golden Phoenix is starting a youth cooking program," she said. "Mr. Chen wants to coordinate with our classes. He says kids should learn to feed their community as well as protect it." Jai-yun smiled. This was how real change happened, not through dramatic confrontations, but through small, daily actions that brought people together. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Lee. "Gang activity reported in next county. Their community center wants to talk to you about starting similar programs." This wasn't the first such request. Word had spread about what happened with the steel serpents. Other communities wanted to learn how to stand together, how to build strength through unity. Jai-yun began typing a response, offering to help. She thought about how far they'd come from that night at the gas station. The confrontation had been necessary, but the real victory had come after. In the way people had come together, in the programs they'd built, in the community they'd strengthened. Her first class would arrive soon. Today they would learn new techniques, but more importantly, they would continue building something that no gang could destroy: a sense of belonging, of responsibility to each other. Outside her window, she could see people arriving at the center. Mrs. Lee was helping an elderly neighbor up the steps. Some of her teenage students were picking up litter in the parking lot, part of their community service project. Maya was putting up posters for the youth program. Jai-yun gathered her teaching materials, ready to start another day. She wasn't Captain Park of Special Forces anymore, and that was fine. She had become something else, something just as important: a builder of community, a teacher of strength. The morning sun filled the practice room with warm light as her students began to arrive. They bowed as they entered, showing respect not just to their teacher but to each other. Jai-yun bowed back, grateful for this new mission, this new way of serving. "Ready to begin?" she asked. Her students straightened, ready to learn. Behind them, through the window, she could see her grandmother arriving with breakfast for everyone, just as she did every morning now. The neighborhood was awake, alive, stronger than ever. "Yes, teacher," her students responded in unison. Jai-yun smiled. This was how victories were really won, not just in moments of confrontation, but in daily choices to stand together, to help each other, to build something lasting. "Then let's begin," she said, ready to teach another lesson about strength, about community, about the power of standing together. The story of the Special Forces veteran who stood up to a gang had spread far and wide, but the real story was what came after: a community that learned to stand together, to protect its own, to build something stronger than fear. And that story was still being written, one lesson at a time, one day at a time, in a community center that had become a symbol of hope and unity.